My brother turned my life into a nightmare, and then got my wife pregnant. Now, after our parents cut ties with him and left me their $5 million inheritance, he's asking for my help. My younger brother, Ron, has always held a deep, inexplicable grudge against me. It wasn't jealousy. He was the golden child, showered with all the attention and affection our parents could offer. There was no logical reason for him to resent me. To paint a clearer picture, our mother doted on Ron in every possible way. He was her pride and joy. She cooked his favorite meals, handled his laundry, and even enlisted me to tutor him with his schoolwork. The expectation that I should always help him out came simply from the fact that we were family, but that generosity was never reciprocated. I didn't really complain about it, as I was always independent, preferring to take care of myself. In hindsight, maybe I enabled his behavior by always catering to his needs without asking for anything in return. Ron never lifted a finger to help me when I was in need. The only time he approached me was when he wanted something from me. I was the quiet, introverted kid who found solace in books and solitude, whereas Ron was loud, brash, and took after our father. I've always been direct and honest, never one to sugarcoat my words, and I think this bluntness contributed to my mother's growing disfavor toward me. As the years went by, Ron became the apple of the family's eye, and I didn't mind much during our childhood. But things took a dark turn when Ron started tormenting and ridiculing me for not being like him. He used to make fun of my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then tattletale to my mom about what I had written. When I confronted him and complained to our parents about him invading my privacy, they would just laugh it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. But it got worse. He did things like nearly breaking my glasses and tampering with my food in disgusting ways. Once, he even put small stones in my cereal, but luckily, I noticed them before they could do any harm to my teeth. When I told my mom, she brushed it off, saying, "That's just how brothers bond." Whenever we fought, Ron knew exactly how to hit me where it hurt. We went to the same school, so he knew I was already dealing with bullies. Instead of standing up for me, he joined them, calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and even egged them on to hurt me physically, telling them I was nothing but a failure. I remember once during an argument over something so trivial I can't even recall, he told me I should just kill myself. Most of his insults didn't faze me, but that one cut deep because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. I'm doing better now, but it was soul-crushing to hear my own brother wish I was dead. With Dad always at work and Mom seemingly indifferent, she even scolded me once, saying it was my fault for annoying him. Things just kept getting worse. In high school, there was a particularly horrifying incident when Ron actually tried to set my hair on fire, and shockingly, our mom defended him, saying he was just playing around. Who even does that? Thankfully, my dad finally stepped in and saw the seriousness of the situation. He threatened to call the police on Ron, and for the first time, my brother was genuinely shocked. He had never faced any real consequences for his actions before. Dad made it crystal clear that enough was enough, and that Ron needed to start treating me with respect. Later, Dad came into my room to talk. I never expected him to take my side, especially since he had always told Ron how much they were alike. And it was true. Dad admitted that he had been waiting for years, hoping Ron would grow out of it, but he was starting to realize that Ron was turning into a real bully. Hearing this from my father was a moment of profound validation, and I nearly broke down in tears. I opened up to him about everything Ron had done to me over the years, even revealing the relentless bullying I faced at school. My father was taken aback by the extent of my suffering. The very next day, he went straight to the school principal, ensuring that those bullies were warned of serious repercussions if they didn't stop their torment. Later that evening, my dad signed me up for MMA classes at the local gym, insisting that I needed to toughen up and learn to stand up to the bullies in my life. I'll admit, the idea of a bookish kid like me learning how to fight might have seemed a bit ridiculous, but I was determined. I managed my time effectively, balancing both my academics and daily training. The MMA lessons transformed not just my physique, but my entire outlook on life. Then came the day when Ron pulled another one of his stunts. He swiped the pocket money I'd been diligently saving up from the allowance we earned doing chores. Ron had sneaked into my room and taken it, and I caught him just as he was about to ride off with his friends. I demanded he return my money, but he just laughed, taunting me that all I could do was run crying to our dad. Something inside me snapped, and I punched him square in the face. The look of shock on his face as he stumbled back was unforgettable. I grabbed my money from his pocket and pushed him back down. Ron started bawling, which in hindsight was oddly amusing. However, my mom rushed out, alarmed by the commotion, and when she realized I had hit Ron, she was stunned. She scolded me, insisting I should set a better example for my younger brother, who, by the way, seemed to take some sick pleasure in seeing me get reprimanded. My mom later complained to my dad, suggesting that I needed to be disciplined. My dad, with a stern expression, asked both of us to explain what had happened. I told him how Ron had stolen the money I had worked hard to save, while Ron tried to justify his actions, saying he needed it for a date, and that as his brother, I should have been more understanding. My father, however, wasn't having any of it. He told Ron he was fortunate that I only hit him, reminding him that anyone else might have called the police. He made it clear that Ron had no right to take anything that didn't belong to him without asking. Ron wasn't pleased with the situation and erupted in anger, likely hoping our mother would take his side. However, our father stood his ground. When Ron realized there wouldn't be any consequences for me after what happened, he yelled out how much he despised me and stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. From that moment on, Ron began to withdraw from me. He finally understood that his days of bullying me were over, and even Dad had stopped indulging his behavior. For the first time in ages, I felt like we were on equal footing. Though he no longer had the upper hand physically, he turned to verbal jabs when our parents were out of earshot. As he grew older, his behavior deteriorated, his anger flaring up more frequently, his patience thinning. If I approached him with a question, he would simply walk away, muttering insults like geek or loser under his breath. Whenever he needed something, he would relay his requests through our mother instead of addressing me directly. When I asked her why Ron couldn't speak to me himself, she would always tell me to be more patient with him. I couldn't discern whether his hostility stemmed from the throes of adolescence or from a deeper, more genuine hatred. As time went on, enduring his constant criticism became more and more exhausting, and I started longing for the day I could leave home. I repeatedly begged my mother to sit us down for a conversation to resolve our issues, but she always declined, insisting she didn't want to get involved. When I pressed her for her thoughts on why Ron treated me this way, she would dismiss the question altogether. Eventually, I earned a scholarship to my dream university, and finally had a way out. My dad threw a celebration in my honor, and even my mom seemed genuinely proud. But Ron remained cold and distant, barely acknowledging my success. The day I left for college was a bittersweet one, filled with excitement for the future, and an overwhelming sense of relief to finally escape the toxic atmosphere of home. The first few months at college felt like a breath of fresh air. I found new friends, enjoyed my studies, and began to carve out a life distinct from the oppressive environment of my childhood. The constant dread of Ron's verbal assaults faded, granting me a long-awaited sense of peace. During my sophomore year, I met Selena at a fraternity party through a mutual friend, and we instantly connected. Coming from a deeply religious family, having children out of wedlock was strongly discouraged. However, when we discovered she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to get married right after graduation. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair, yet full of joy. Our parents were thrilled for us, and we cherished the celebration. At that moment, I was convinced Selena was my soulmate. I had always envisioned a life of commitment, sharing my world with one woman. Although other women expressed interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Selena was my dream, and the thought of hurting her never crossed my mind. But as time passed, I uncovered 2 instances of infidelity in our marriage. The first was an on-and-off affair with a married coworker that spanned several years. The second was a brief fling with an ex-boyfriend during a visit to her family. Some might call me naive, and in hindsight, I can't entirely disagree. Each time we separated, I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want our child to grow up in a broken home, and I believed we could overcome these challenges. The affair with her coworker occurred when we were younger, and I chalked it up to the mistakes and poor judgment of youth. For a while, things seemed to improve. Though I could never fully regain my trust in her, I tried my best to push aside my doubts, understanding that if I chose to forgive, I needed to genuinely strive for a new beginning. It's been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt secure in my decision to give her another chance. Selena seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy, making plans for our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more when she confessed to having had a long-term affair, and hinted that our son might not be mine. Her words hit me like a freight train. A storm of shock, betrayal, and disbelief overwhelmed me. I struggled to grasp the magnitude of her confession. In a state of confusion, I managed to ask why she had kept such a significant secret, and how she could have done something so devastating. Her reaction was cold, almost indifferent, as if she were detached from the pain she had caused. Her vague responses only fueled my confusion, leaving me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and agonizing moment, facing the crumbling trust and the uncertainty surrounding my own family. I kept pressing Selena for the truth, because I felt I deserved to know the father of the child I had raised from birth. Eventually, she revealed it was Ron. I was stunned as I asked her to clarify. She explained that she and Ron had become close when I introduced her to my family, and she stayed with us from Thanksgiving through New Year's. Ron, usually cold and distant with me, was warm and polite to her, which made me happy because I didn't want Selena to feel unwelcome. Selena was eager to be accepted by my family, so she spent a lot of time with my mom whenever she could. She noticed the tension between Ron and me and asked me about it. I opened up about our strained relationship and mentioned that we might never repair it due to his unresolved feelings. Selena understood, but began including Ron in our outings, hoping it would help us bond. Whenever we planned to watch a movie, she invited Ron, and we watched whatever he chose. During this time, Ron and I exchanged a few words, which was an improvement from his usual silence. I remember Selena and Ron hanging out and playing video games together, but I didn't think much of it. Selena told me that one day, Ron confided in her about his struggles and a recent breakup. Feeling vulnerable, he formed a friendship with her. She mentioned that he would flirt with her when I wasn't around, and eventually, things escalated beyond her control. The thought of my wife and brother together made me feel sick. Selena admitted that she felt guilty afterward and left him, which explained her sudden decision to return home instead of spending New Year's with me. Although I tried to convince her to stay, she was determined to leave. When we met back at college after the holidays, she was her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Selena admitted she didn't know if the child was mine or Ron's, and without any way to prove it, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more reliable brother. This was the reason we got married. My world felt like it was crumbling. The son I had loved and raised might not even be mine. I asked Selena if she had continued seeing Ron recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had stayed in touch because their chemistry was undeniable. They would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working late. She admitted that half of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with him. I asked why she married me if she wanted my brother, and Selena said she didn't want to be the one to end the marriage. She saw me as a wonderful father to our son and decided to stay. In her words, she made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I told Selena I appreciated her honesty but that I was leaving. She started crying, asking for forgiveness, expecting me to lash out at her. Instead, I calmly packed my things. Selena insisted that if I truly loved her, I would fight for her and that every marriage has its challenges. When she realized I wasn't going to do anything, she shifted tactics, saying our son would be affected by a divorce and that children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, which made her cry even harder and accuse me of being cruel. It seemed like she believed there was nothing that could make me want to leave the marriage. Maybe it was partly my fault for ignoring the warning signs over the years. Though I did love her, much of that affection seemed rooted in the fact that we shared a son and had been together since our college days. Selena kept pleading that it wasn't too late to salvage our relationship, but I found it hard to believe her and had run out of patience. Trust had been shattered, and her words felt empty and meaningless. Even if I could find it in myself to forgive, I knew I could never erase the memory of her betrayal with my own brother. I've always believed in forgiving others because we all have our flaws, but this was unforgivable. I walked away, leaving her in tears on the doorstep, and checked into a hotel. The next day, I went straight to my parents and told them everything about Selena's affair with Ron, revealing that they had been secretly involved for years. The shock on their faces was impossible to miss. True to form, my mother initially tried to defend Ron, insisting that her son could never betray his own brother in such a way. Determined to uncover the truth, I asked my parents to stay quiet while I called Ron in front of them. I wanted him to think it was a private conversation so I could catch him off guard. When Ron answered the phone, I confronted him about the affair. At first, he denied it vehemently, refusing to take any responsibility. But when I told him Selena had confessed everything, he shifted the blame onto her, calling her untrustworthy. He claimed it wasn't his fault if women were drawn to him, boasting that he was the more attractive brother. I told him firmly that I would expose him to everyone. When he laughed and taunted me, saying no one would believe me because he was the favored son, I let out a dry laugh, thanking him for confirming the truth, knowing full well our parents had heard every word. Ron fell silent, then stammered, trying to backtrack and salvage his reputation. My mother, still reeling from the shock, demanded that Ron explain himself. His words stumbled out in a weak attempt to justify his actions, as he shifted blame to everyone but himself, even trying to point the finger at Selena. I could see the disappointment and anger brewing in my mother's eyes, emotions she had never directed at her once favored son. In that heated moment, a strange sense of justice washed over me. For years I had suffered under Ron's cruelty, but now the truth was out, and the tables had turned. It was Ron who stood exposed, his wrongdoings no longer hidden from view. As Ron's excuses faltered, my father, usually restrained in his emotions, could no longer hold back his disappointment. He asked me to hand him the phone and began to address Ron directly. "Ron," he began, his voice heavy with disillusionment. "What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother, it's a betrayal of this entire family. You slept with your brother's wife and continued the affair even after they were married." My father let his words hang in the air, their gravity sinking into Ron's consciousness. "Your actions carry serious consequences and have irreparably broken the trust we placed in you. I raised both of you to value family, loyalty, and decency. What you've shown today is a complete rejection of everything I've tried to instill in you." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to deepen. "Your disregard for your brother's feelings and the disrespect you've shown towards his marriage are intolerable. You've not only caused him pain, but have also ripped apart the very fabric that holds this family together. Your mother and I must accept some responsibility for what you've become. But we will no longer condone this behavior. As of today, you're cut off from the college fund I set aside for you. You'll need to find your own way to cover your university expenses from now on. I will no longer be financing your lifestyle. Do you think sleeping with married women makes you more of a man? Let's see how you manage on your own without my financial support." Throughout this exchange, I kept my composure. While my initial impulse was to yell at Ron, seeing my father discipline him was the most satisfying form of justice. I had exposed who Ron truly was, and it was evident he hadn't anticipated the full weight of his actions. Despite Ron's desperate attempts to justify himself, my mother, surprisingly, still tried to defend him. But my father was resolute. He ended the conversation abruptly, cutting off Ron's feeble explanations. Later, my mom came over to me and wrapped her arms around me. It had been a long time since we'd shared such an embrace, but in that hug, there was a silent acknowledgement and solidarity amidst the family chaos. She apologized for not believing me sooner. As a 14-year-old, I never would have imagined this moment, being vindicated and embraced by my own mother. After that, my father assisted me in finding a reputable lawyer to file for divorce from Selena. She and her attorney tried to play dirty, demanding alimony because I earned more, but her affair heavily tipped the scales in my favor. We also arranged a paternity test, and it was confirmed. Ron was indeed the child's father. The revelation was excruciating, far worse than learning about Selena's betrayal. The anger of realizing the son I had loved and nurtured wasn't biologically mine was overwhelming, but I chose to remain strong. Selena pleaded with me to keep visiting the boy, arguing he shouldn't be punished for the situation, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I looked at him, I saw Ron, and it filled me with resentment. Once the divorce was finalized, I felt an immense sense of liberation as I moved into my own bachelor apartment. It was surreal to be living alone, especially since I'd married young and had never really had the chance to experience life on my own. However, my naturally independent spirit made the transition smooth, and I quickly came to enjoy my newfound freedom. Just 2 weeks ago, my dad called to tell me he was considering changing his will, not wanting to leave anything to Ron. My father is incredibly stubborn, and once he decided to cut Ron out of his life, there was no turning back. Ron tried to reach out to our parents, even going so far as to show up at their door, pleading for forgiveness. But they turned him away. Even my mother, who had always had a soft spot for Ron, seemed to have reached her limit, despite how difficult it must have been for her. Ron never bothered to send me a message of apology for what he had done, proving that he felt no remorse. His only concern was being cut off from our parents. My father confided in me that he intended to leave everything to me, ensuring that Ron wouldn't be able to contest it later. Ron was to receive only a single $1. I was stunned when I heard this. My father had worked tirelessly his whole life, building up his assets, retirement savings, and life insurance, amounting to nearly $5 million. The only condition in his will was that if he passed away before my mom, she would continue to live in their home, although ownership would be transferred to me. I had no issue with this, as I intended to care for my mother in her final days. Somehow Ron found out about the will, and unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday, trying to patch things up. He spoke of how he was struggling with college, and how after Selena discovered the truth about the child's paternity, she had been hounding him for child support. He claimed he was broke and was desperately searching for part-time jobs, but hadn't found any. He begged me to speak to the family on his behalf, saying he needed a fresh start and my help. I laughed in his face, telling him I was done with him. I reminded him that he should have considered the consequences before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant. Ron argued that I was being unfair and pointed out that Selena was equally to blame. I agreed and reminded him that I had divorced her, making her his problem now. He had no right to call me, complaining about her or the child. Those were the consequences of his own choices. When Ron started to raise his voice, I cut him off, reminding him that he was no longer the golden child of the family, but the outcast who had slept with his own brother's wife. At that moment, Ron broke down in tears, confessing to me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned their backs on him. While his words rang true, I no longer felt any responsibility towards him. I made it clear that our relationship was over and that he should never contact me again, as I no longer considered him my brother. Since that day, I've replayed that conversation in my mind. Despite the deep resentment I harbored for Ron, I had never witnessed him cry, at least not since our childhood. I won't deny it. It did sting a bit to see him so vulnerable. So, I suppose I'm here seeking advice. Should I talk to our parents about him, or would I be wrong for staying silent? Update 1. Hello everyone. Many of you have asked why I am no longer in touch with my son Henry, with some even labeling me as heartless. I feel I need to clarify that I cannot raise another man's child. This isn't a typical stepfather situation. I was made to believe Henry was my biological son, only to later discover he is actually my brother Ron's child. Naturally, this revelation was devastating, and I spent days in tears. The main reason I want no contact with Henry is that I'm determined to cut Selena out of my life completely. If I remain connected to her child, she'll inevitably find a way back into my life, and I need my distance. You may think I'm being harsh or selfish, but I can't see Henry again, at least not for a very long time. Update 2. Many of you correctly guessed that it was my mother who informed Ron about my father's decision to change his will, which led Ron to reach out to me as a last resort to try to mend things. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down, saying that I had punished Ron enough and that he had learned his lesson. My father then sternly told my mother that if she truly believed Ron's actions were forgivable, he couldn't remain married to her, as he could never forgive such a betrayal. This ultimatum silenced her. My dad made it clear that if she ever spoke to Ron again and we found out, she would have to pack her things and leave. As I mentioned earlier, my dad is incredibly stubborn. I can only hope my mom learns from her past mistakes. Here's an update for those following along. It's been 5 months since my last post, and my relationship with my parents has definitely gotten better over this time. Every weekend, my dad and I go golfing together, and he started treating me more like a friend than just his son. While my mom still thinks about Ron, she's kept her distance from him. The last I heard about Ron was from my cousin, who mentioned that he's been asking everyone for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the tuition. Ron and Selena are living together now, and he's working part-time as a mechanic. It seems like they're raising Henry together, which I suppose is a positive development. I never bring up Ron with my parents, and they don't mention him either. For those who are curious, I'm doing quite well. I got promoted at work 2 months ago, which came with a significant pay raise. I'm not seeing anyone right now because I feel like I still need time and space to heal. I've been going to therapy, so we'll see how that goes. Thanks for sticking with me, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around us.